Hello, everyone. We are just about ready to get started with our third and final panel of the day. This panel is going to examine how slavery impacts property and land ownership in Colorado today. I'm Sam McCarthy, a second-year law student here at CU Law and a fellow with the Byron White Center. I'm going to briefly introduce our panelists and then we'll get started. First, we have Dr. Tom Romero, who is an associate professor of law in the affiliated faculty with the Department of History at Denver University. He teaches and researches in the areas of legal history of the American West, with a particular emphasis on the relationship between race and water law, school desegregation, property, land use, and urban development and local government. Next, we will have Rita Lewis, who is an attorney and a proud Denver native. All three of our panelists are also Denver natives, by the way, which is fitting considering that this is the local impact panel. Rita was the former executive director of the Denver Metro Fair Housing Council and the former president of the Denver branch of the NAACP. She's also an alum of CU Law. And last but not least, we have Councilwoman Candi CdeBaca, who is the Denver District 9 Councilwoman. She's a fierce advocate against the criminalization of poverty. She advocates against environmental racism and the displacement of Denver's Black and brown communities. She's a fifth-generation Denver native and also the first LGBTQ Latina and first Democratic Socialist to serve on Denver City Council. So without any further ado, I'll pass it over to Professor Romero to get us started.
Thank you. Okay, I can hear myself. This is a tough panel, the last panel of the day. But certainly applaud all of you for being here. I just want to give a thank you to Professor Malveaux, Dr. Delgado, Dean Buckner-Innes, and the students that have put this together as part of this conference. I have seen these conferences over the year, and I think this is one of the most courageous and honest ones that I have seen. And I really want to point out why leadership matters. Leadership does matter, and we're going to see that today on this panel. And I'm really honored to be on the panel with two such tremendous leaders in our community. I also want to acknowledge just the privilege of being in this space, the facility staff, those that brought us our lunches and our food, those that maintain these beautiful grounds. To be able to have these conversations in these types of spaces and in these moments are done by so many people. So I do want to acknowledge all those that have made this happen as part of this. My job today is to tee up the real ways that we can think about this issue of slavery and its legacy here in Colorado. I have had the privilege, I have had a long time to think about this as really from almost the day I was born. And I'll talk a little bit about what that means here. And all of us as being born and raised in Denver, this will all be a familiar sort of history. I want to start out here with something that many of you might think about when you're thinking about Colorado, right? If you're driving down I-25, if you're driving down I-70 and you're coming into the state, this is a sign that often greets you. And for the purposes of time, I would normally ask, what does this image, what does colorful Colorado invoke for you? And so I'll answer, right? Purple Mountains majesty, the red rocks, right, here in Boulder, the golden fields of grain out to the east. And what's missing from that? People, absolutely, right? This is a state with a rich history. It's inscribed, as you'll see, and as I'll talk about, with all sorts of ways in which the color line, right, has come to have huge consequences for how we think about race and race relations today. So my talk here is broken into three parts. First, I want to talk about this color blind, this color conscious conflict that is really at the root of some of the tensions and some of the ways that we don't deal with problems in this state. I then want to talk more precisely about how property law has been at the center of constructing the color line and its legacies. I then want to bring us back to the present day, tee up my fellow panelists to talk a little bit about what have been the implications for us. So these are the three parts of my talk. Few notes on terminology. One, to bring us back to something that I know was talked about in the very first panel today, right? Race as a social construct, right? It's not real, right? It has no meaning unless it's given in import and meaning by law, right? Law is what creates race. Law is what makes race meaningful, right? And we saw it in the previous panel. We talked about all the ways that the criminal law system, right, has been disciplinary, right? It makes race real. But it does it in all sorts of other ways, right? So I really want us to think about law and the importance of law in creating the color line. Here in Colorado, and I think this is probably true in many other spaces in the United States and across the world, we also deal with this tension. And I sort of think about this back to 2008, when Barack Obama was elected. We had at the University of Denver a symposium on post-racialism, right? This idea that somehow we have moved beyond race, right? And we live in this colorblind moment. This notion of colorblindness is certainly at the center of much of the law we've been talking about today, right? So one of the things I want you to do is to sort of reframe that. What does a color conscious lens look like, right? When we start thinking about the legacy of slavery, particularly here in Colorado. Final point here, and I was sort of thinking about it with Dr. Mitchell in particular. We talked about earlier today about the importance of uncovering these histories, of speaking about the importance and the legacy of histories that aren't talked about in the textbooks, in your law school classrooms, even in the courts when history is important, right? So I hear him invoking Chicano movement lawyer Oscar Zeta Acosta. I've been actually doing a lot of writing where I invoke the idea of a brown buffalo, right? To really bring the perspective of a brown person in a space like law, right? An activist, a lawyer, to understanding and thinking about this history and its legacy today. All right. So welcome to Colorful Colorado. What does this mean and what does this look like? I'm going to be going through a lot of slides. The images are just meant to be impressionistic, right? This state has this idea and has been thought of as a racial utopia, right? One perfect example of this is the town of Deerfield, which you see on here, right? Which was an African-American community that was formed in the late 19th and early 20th century, not far from here in Boulder, which was designed as a place where African-Americans could, as you see on here, put on the garments of self-government, right? Could have self-determination, right? And so these ideas of Colorado, Denver as a place that's sort of devoid of a history of racism, right, of slavery, were very prevalent, right, and were ubiquitous in many places. Here, the fair play reigns, the color line does not exist. This came from an African-American newspaper, from an African-American journalist who was taking a tour in Denver in the 1950s. Gunnar Myrdal, the American sociologist who wrote An American Dilemma, talked about the lack of racial tension in a place like Colorado when he was writing his book. But of course, and this goes to the conundrum, right? This is a state that is inscribed with a deep racialized history. Anti-Chinese activities, violence happened in the 1880s. One of the largest anti-Chinese riots in the United States took place in Denver. And I know we heard just yesterday, there's going to be an apology from the city and county of Denver for that. The Ku Klux Klan rose to prominence, and in fact, Colorado became the epicenter of Ku Klux Klan activity in the 1920s. The governor was a Klan member. One of the United States federal senators was a Klan member. The majority of state senators and legislators were Klan members. The chief of police of Denver was a Klan member. The mayor of Denver was a Klan member. Colorado was the epicenter of that, right, in the 1920s. Anti-Mexican sentiment compelled the governor in the 1930s to declare martial law in the state of Colorado for only the second time in the history of Colorado. There was National Guard units that were mobilized to the border. And not every border. There wasn't National Guard going to Wyoming or to Utah or to Oklahoma. Where did they go to? New Mexico. Now, I don't know how many of you know that Colorado has actually an international border. Well, maybe at one time, way, way, way back in the past, right? But this is the sort of pieces in terms of, as we're inscribing and thinking about the nature certainly of colonialism, which I'll talk more about here today. Jump it forward in time. Denver in 1983 elected Federico Peña as mayor of Denver. Federico Peña was the first Mexican-American mayor to be elected as mayor of a city Denver size in the United States, right? So it seemed to suggest a racial progressivism that harkened back to this idea that the color line doesn't exist. But of course, and much more recently, right, we know that these images, these racialized ideas, right, continue to animate our landscapes. So what explains that? How is that rooted? I think most importantly, it's important to think about Colorado as a state that was forged in state-sanctioned racialized violence. That it had a lot of really interesting dimensions. If you look at this map here, Colorado, what became Colorado, was actually at the center of the conflict between the North and the South during the Civil War, right? And it really represented and symbolized the ways that slavery was going to move forward and white supremacy was going to move forward in the future of the country and or not, right? But of course, the color line came to be inscribed in a variety of different ways, right? We actually had segregated schools, right? State-sanctioned segregated schools here in Colorado. We had anti-miscegenation laws, right, that prevented marriage between blacks and whites. We know of the Sand Creek Massacre, right? The involvement of the United States government, the state territorial governor, in the massacre of Arapaho and Cheyenne elders, women, and children that were flying under a banner of peace on the banks of the Sand Creek in November of 1864. We also have a constitution that is bilingual, right? It required until 1899 that all public acts, all public laws be written in Spanish as well as German. Had a slavery prohibition in our state constitution. Provided for property rights of immigrants, right? So this tension is at the heart of certainly how we think about what Colorado means and the legacy of slavery. But I would say the legacy of white supremacy, the legacy of settler colonialism. So as a matter of property law, what does this look like? How did the color line come to get constructed in terms that we understand? Well, we had racially restrictive covenants in this state, right? As early as 1930, the Colorado Supreme Court said it was the public policy of the state of Colorado to enforce these covenants, right? And they happen in a variety of different spaces, right? And here's a typical covenant. And what did they look like and sort of where did they appear, right? So if you look at this map of Denver and you see the stars on here, these are where the racial restrictive covenants are found, right? In the records and the deeds, right? Well, why here and why not other parts of the city? Well, because you see in the circles here, they really contained where communities of color were living in the city at the time, right? Reinforced, of course, by real estate agents, by housing policy, right? By lending policy. This is the redlining map of the city. I'm not good with GIS, so you got to imagine for yourself overlaying these maps over one another. So I'll kind of do it for you here a bit, but you know, these are all reinforcing each other, I think, in some important ways. Family law as well as criminal law, just to highlight, right? We had an anti-miscegenation law. Where were the anti-miscegenation laws enforced? They were enforced, right, on the edges of the red and the yellow areas, right? Right, to keep those neighborhoods from being integrated, right, by the police. Interestingly enough, Colorado has the only provision like this in the country because it creates a carve-out for the territories that were formerly part of the Republic of Mexico, right, that were tied to the United States' war against Mexico and the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, right, which speaks to a different legacy of slavery and a different legacy of the color line, right, that's connected to that part of the world and its history. We see here some of the ways, as I mentioned, the way that the interracial marriage ban worked. It was enforced against not just blacks and whites, but against Chinese and others. Policing, right? This comes from a police manual in the 1950s. And you see the ways that the police are already embedding in their training, right? Identifying what are the communities of color. And I sort of always point out, I don't know what the problem was with Hollanders on here. So if someone can help me out, I still haven't figured that piece out. Another example here, right? We see huge rise in the arrest rates, right, of people of color beginning in the 1940s. Now, there are a lot of reasons that explain this, and I'll just jump to the punchline now in the sake of time. The biggest change here that happened began in 1942 when the Denver Police Department arrested people. They had these intake forms. And on the forms, they only had two racial categories, white and black, right? And then it actually had all these check marks for nationalities or ethnic categories, right? Mexican, Finnish, German, English, right? In 1943, it eliminated all those ethnic and racial categories and created basically, I kind of put in quotes here, the categories that ended up being the racial categories. This is the color line, right, at play. And of course, it's being reinforced, right, with all of these maps that are happening. Finally, as we think about what are the implications and the ramifications of property as connected to family law, as criminal law, had a manifestation in terms of schooling and education law. Denver, the Denver Public Schools had the first non-Southern school desegregation case to reach the United States Supreme Court. It made its way to the court ultimately in 1973. And as this case began to be formulated, right, one of the things that the plaintiffs had to figure out was what is going on, right? Like how do we have these segregated neighborhoods, we have these segregated schools, but we have laws that seem to suggest otherwise, right? So this is, I think, a real good example of it. And we think to the modern day, I think of Justice Ginsburg's dissent in the Shelby County case. I mean, in some ways, this is that second and third generation discrimination that's happening, right? In terms of how institutions are manipulating property and data, right, to maximize segregation. And ultimately, as we get to the case of Keys versus Denver School Board in 1973, and this is where I need to be a GIS expert, right? It was these maps and charts that told the story. So imagine all those maps that I pointed out for you, right? I have sort of census maps here. George Bardwell, I would say he's my colleague. He was actually a mathematician at the University of Denver that became the key expert witness for the plaintiffs in that case. And with his students, right, just started to track, right, and to do early GIS mapping, right, to ultimately find, right, that Denver schools were segregated. And ultimately what they found out too with this mapping is that the Denver School Board every year was manipulating the attendance boundaries, every year, right, to maximize segregation in Denver schools. And of course, there's backlash against that piece, right? And of course, when the federal courts find that the schools should be desegregated root and branch, there was, of course, violence against that, right? Bombing of the school buses, threats against the judges, threats against the lawyers. The lawyers that litigated this case were actually run out of town. They were run out of town, right? Change the state constitution. A couple of things that they did was actually prevent integration from happening. One was just to prevent integration from happening as a matter of school attendance, but also through annexation, right? The ways that a city could grow and build, right? And so ultimately, what was the consequence of this? It again maximized segregation. It's a legacy of white supremacy. All right, let me get to the final part here of my tee-up. What is the consequence of this? What does this mean for Colorado moving forward? We know that Colorado, like the rest of the country, is rapidly moving to a minority-majority population, right? It's going to happen by 2050, if not sooner, right? But nevertheless, we continue to have these areas of segregation and of harm, right? This is a great map that the Colorado Department of Public Health and the Environment has just created that identifies two 2,387,000 people, most of them people of color, right, that live in disproportionately impacted communities in the state of Colorado, right? So this kind of gives you a visual here, what that looks like. In Denver, we can sort of think about the implications of segregated communities and of gentrification, which is a huge issue that is happening not just in Denver, but all over the urban and metropolitan United States. What does gentrifying mean? One of my colleagues at the University of Denver, Dr. Maria Salazar, has called gentrification whiteification, because what it means is that it's usually white, affluent people that move into neighborhoods, right, that have pushed historic communities of color out, right, to the boundaries. So gentrification is certainly a connection to, right, settler colonialism. We were just talking prior to this, the legacies and the vestiges that exist in neighborhoods that we live in. The neighborhood that I live in is the former airport, which was named after the mayor of Denver that I said was part of the Ku Klux Klan, right? Huge effort for years to change the name of the neighborhood, right? To no longer be Stapleton, right? And Ben Stapleton is here. It led to a whole lot of nothing, right? Because people, it was going to cost too much, and people were so invested in the neighborhood and what it meant. And of course, it's a very affluent neighborhood, right? That is very homogenous in some problematic ways. Ultimately, in 2020, as a result of the larger nation as well as worldwide struggle against racial violence, right? There was a movement that worked to change the name of Stapleton, right? Ultimately, the neighborhood gets called Central Park. And what I want to point out here is we in the neighborhood had an opportunity to name the neighborhood after Marlon Green, who was the first African-American pilot hired by Continental Airlines, which was based in Denver. Now, that's a whole nother presentation, but he used Colorado's early civil rights law to ultimately compel Continental Airlines to hire him, right? So we could have renamed this space in honor of Marlon Green, and we didn't. And we made it the most generic, boring name ever, right? Of course, what does gentrification do? It pushes communities of color out to the suburbs, right? And many of our most important racial struggles in the color line moving in the suburbs are happening in these sorts of places. So Elijah McClain, which was our George Floyd here in Colorado, right, took place in a Denver suburb of Aurora, right? And that was the context and the piece of it. Finally, as I'm sort of going through here, we see, of course, this has an economic impact, right? Has an impact to today in terms of education. It was already talked about in the previous panel, right? Communities of color in Colorado are over-policed, over-incarcerated, right? We see the huge investment that goes into prisons and not schools, as perfect examples of this. The huge investment that goes into prisons and not into healthcare or in terms of, sort of property ownership, if you want to end there. So for me personally, I want to bring it home to us here in higher education. A couple of my mentors, well, one of my mentors who helped to put this collection together, Frank Tuitt, was with me at the University of Denver. He's now the Chief Diversity Officer at the University of Connecticut. He wrote this book with Bianca Williams, who was a professor here at CU in the Ethnic Studies Department. She did not receive tenure while she was here. And one of the things that they talked about with their experiences at DU and the University of Colorado was higher education, the property of higher education, the space of higher education, the intellectual property of higher education, right, as being no different than a plantation, right? So what does that look like for us at the University of Denver? I want to go back to one of our founders, John Evans. His name adorns many pieces of public property, right, in the state of Colorado. Mount Evans, which is currently being renamed, right? Because what is the problem with John Evans? Well, he actually advocated the genocide of indigenous peoples from this area, right? He was a founder of the University of Denver, as well as a founder of Northwestern University. What complicates this story, and it goes back to the colorblind conundrum, he was appointed by Abraham Lincoln. He was an abolitionist, right? So tied to the University of Denver, what does this mean? My university continues to be and embrace and call ourselves the pioneers. But of course, as you see in this imagery and iconography and intellectual property, right? It is connected. It will always be connected to John Evans. John Shivington, who was on our founding board of trustees, was the US general that ordered the attack on Sand Creek, right? You just kind of see this here. I'll give you a sense, right? The pioneer legacy continues to do violence because we don't talk about it. We refuse to acknowledge, right, how this particular term, right, is connected in particular to settler colonialism, but of course, white supremacy. So we're thinking, I'm waiting for Boone to appear in the championship game of the hockey. University of Denver just made it to the championship game of the NCAA. We see this within our alumni, right? Most importantly, and I sort of connect it here, and as I begin to finish up, there's been some real interesting scholarship that has been coming out, connecting Confederate monuments to pioneer monuments. So back here to Colorado, we need to be thinking about that, right? So the white supremacy of the South, Colorado's no different, right? It's connected very directly to the settler colonialism of this area. Finally, I can't leave without talking about our own Frank Burns School of Real Estate and Construction Management. Who was one of the biggest developers in the Denver area in post-World War II? Denver, Frank Burns. You see it up here. I just pulled this from the website a couple days ago. No talk about how he and his family were directly connected to maximizing, building, growing, encouraging, sustaining segregation in the city. I leave you all with this image. This is actually the image I think we should think about when we enter Colorado, right? It's not this state devoid of people, but it's inscribed with this complicated and very colorful history. So thank you.
All right, thank you so much to Professor Romero for giving us that foundation to base this panel off of. We're now going to switch to a brief video that will introduce Rita Lewis's talk about slavery's impact on fair housing laws.
Few in the nation believe that fair housing would, in our time, become the unchallenged law of this land. And indeed, this bill has had a long and stormy trip.
Well, I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. And I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man.
Ladies and gentlemen, Martin Luther King was shot and was killed tonight in Memphis.
The death of the prophet of nonviolence set off the worst outbreak of arson, looting, and criminal activity in the nation's history. Washington's ghettos burned within a few blocks of the nation's capital.
The life of a man who symbolized the freedom and faith of America has been taken. And no words of mine can fill the void of the eloquent voice that has been stilled. But this I do believe deeply, The dream of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. has not died with him.
President Johnson was willing to speak up and say, we have to pass a fair housing bill.
Hello, Mr. President? Yes, Dick. We're in trouble. We need some help. Yes? I'm afraid of that.
Federal troops, for the first time since the Civil War, took up positions to guard government buildings.
Nothing's probably touchier than your own neighborhood and your own home or your own apartment. The administration, which supported the bill, said this has no chance. The other stuff is okay, but this will kill any politician that touches it.
Well, I just could not live beside them. I don't feel that they should be oppressed. But I moved here because it was a white community.
I have 2 daughters and 2 sons. And if there's too many colored people around here, I definitely will get out.
I think that, well, the property values will immediately go down if they're allowed to move in here in any number.
It seems as though our country is pulling apart into separate societies, where whites have jobs and Negroes have unemployment, where the middle class lives in suburbs and the poor are left in the ghettos, where one group of Americans looks upon another group of Americans with growing mistrust and even dread.
Then the bill went over into the House Rules Committee, and under the chairmanship of the famous Judge Smith, a right-wing segregationist from Virginia, he wouldn't hold hearings on it. He would take the bill home so nobody could act on it, and we were running out of time.
Thousands flowed through the rainy streets of Memphis this day, finishing a march that Dr. King planned to lead in support of striking garbage workers.
How many men must die before we can really have a free and true and peaceful society?
Cause you're present, Lord. And I know you'll reach out and take mine. You take our hand.
The death of Martin Luther King is a tragic thing, but no legislation should be passed as a memorial to anyone.
In spite of the riots, I am going to support this legislation with all the vigor that I possess.
The laws that we pass up here are for all time. The Martin Luther Kings come and go.
The public reaction to this horror gave the sensible members of the committee a compelling argument that the House Rules Committee had to report that bill out. And I think that's how we got our bill. They just didn't dare bottle it up any longer.
And I have a dream that one day Negroes will be able to buy a house anywhere that their money will carry them.
At long last this afternoon, fair housing for all is now a part of the American way of life. Democracy's work is being done, and the bell of freedom rings out a little louder. We have come some of the way, not near all of it.
The fight still goes on because we unfortunately have the laws, but we don't have the enforcement. That we have changed, but we still have the same kinds of discrimination.
The U.S. Commission on Civil Rights said today that efforts by federal agencies to end housing discrimination have been generally superficial or incomplete.
President Carter has ordered federal agencies to use all means possible to strengthen fair housing programs.
For the first time, people with disabilities and families with children will be protected from housing discrimination.
President Reagan signed legislation today designed to toughen up the nation's fair housing laws.
Why did you take part in this demonstration today? Just because there was a huge crowd, or did you have any personal reason?
Well, I took part in this march today because of Martin Luther King and what he stood for, because this march is what he died for.
You know what he stood for?
Yes. He stood for nonviolence and peace for all men of all kinds. And I think if he died for it, I could carry out what he started.
And as you can see, the Fair Housing Act was passed a week after the assassination of Martin Luther King. So I'm going to get right into some discussion, just kind of piggybacking off of what Professor Romero said, because he took most of my notes. So I want to talk about some of the things that Professor Romero mentioned, because it's personal to me. I'm a Denver native. I was born during the time where there was redlining. My parents could not move across the boulevard, as we call it, Colorado Boulevard, from East Denver to Park Hill until the early 60s. So I guess I'm dating myself. And even now in Central Park, I live literally right across Quebec in Park Hill. Park Hill, some portions of Park Hill are gentrified, some portions of Park Hill still look like what they used to, a predominantly Black neighborhood. But I don't think a lot of things have changed. But I'm gonna go through some history with you all and skip all the rest of the stuff I was gonna do. But I wanna talk about, as far back as 1866, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act, which guaranteed property rights to all citizens, regardless of race. So that was really the beginning of the Fair Housing Act. But the Fair Housing Act didn't happen until 1968. The first fair housing case was the case of Shelley versus Kramer. The court held that the state's court enforcement of private restrictive covenants based on race amounted to sufficient government involvement to violate the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. We still have restrictive covenants here in Colorado, specifically Jefferson County. I want to go to another fair housing case. In 1967, a California case, Reitman versus Mulkey, the Supreme Court held that the California State Constitutional Amendment, which basically nullified California's fair housing laws, violated the Equal Protection Clause, because that amendment encouraged private racial housing discrimination. Again, in 1968, Jones versus Alfred H. Mayer Company, the Supreme Court gives new life to the 1866 Civil Rights Act by announcing that it bars racial discrimination, private as well as public, in the sale or rental of any property. In 1977, the case of Village of Arlington Heights versus Metropolitan Housing Development, the court held that a housing corporation and neighborhood residents had standing to challenge a municipality's denial of rezoning, which was alleged to have racially disproportional impact. This is what we see as discriminatory impact and intent, which is required to prove unconstitutional behavior. but oftentimes it's very hard to prove that someone has the intent to racially discriminate against one when it comes to housing. Another fair housing case is Gladstone Realtors versus Bellwood. That was in 1979. The court upheld a municipality and residents standing to sue local real estate brokers for racial steering of Black customers to an integrated area that was a targeted area, whereas white customers were steered away from that targeted area. So I want to fast forward to the present day, right here in Denver, Colorado. In the year 2000, a biracial Denver couple in Park Hill experienced discrimination based on their home appraisal, which came back $145,000 below market rate. This is an example of discrimination and racial bias in the appraisal industry. In 2021, Black and brown senior residents have complained about the lack of safety, security, maintenance, and repairs in their complexes. This is an example of race and age discrimination in Park Hill and Commerce City. And right now, in Green Valley Ranch, Black and brown residents are being foreclosed on by the HOA. And the general consensus is the residents are facing foreclosure because they are people of color. This is an example of discriminatory practices and is currently under investigation. So we don't know what's going on. So in my opinion, we're going backwards. I want to talk about some other things that Professor Romero mentioned. I also personally experienced, and I knew the daughter in the Keys case in regards to the educational discrimination. And when I was going to undergrad at Spelman College, my professor said, well, you don't have Black people in Colorado. I said, yes, we do. And actually, we have a Supreme Court case to prove that. So a lot happens in Colorado. I know we're out here in the West and people don't think that we have racism, but we have restrictive covenants in Lakewood. We have restrictive covenants in Jefferson County. We even used to have a restrictive covenant right in East Denver at Clayton College. Old man Clayton said that I never want to see any people who are Negroes to step foot on this campus. So it happens all around the country, but I don't want to belabor that anymore, and we'll go on to the next panelist.
Can you hear me from right here? Yeah, okay, good. I'm a way less formal individual here, and I come to panels to dialogue and have conversation. But I'll give you guys a little bit of background of where I'm coming from and where how I approach this issue. So the title of what I was going to talk about is From Teepees to Tents, Plantations to Projects, How Far Have We Really Come? When I was a little girl, I was raised by my great-grandmother. She was a sharecropper here in Colorado. She dropped out of school pretty early, second or third grade, because she was epileptic. And so she had to teach herself how to read. And when I was growing up, my favorite thing that she taught me how to do was play word searches and connect dots on little coloring pages. What I didn't realize then was how that skill set that I was building, taught to me by someone who was illiterate by all standards, it would shape the rest of my approach to my life and my work. I spend most of my days connecting dots and searching for the things that you can't readily see. And so when I think about my work right now, a lot of my work feels like we haven't made much progress at all. And so I start with questions. Why have we made so little progress? Why did slavery occur? Why was race created? We know it exists. Dr. Romero showed us all of the data. We know it exists. When you come to the work with a color consciousness, there's no way to be colorblind. When you look at all of the symbolic wins, you would think that we would have less systems of oppression, if oppression at all. So why is it that we have this thing called race? Why did it exist? Why was it created? And you drill down and you recognize that it was created for economic purposes. We created race to justify dehumanizing a subset of our population in order to exploit them to generate profit for a very small few. When slavery ended the first time, we found ways to evolve it. We found ways to protect this economic structure that was appended by ending slavery. And so when I approach the work today, you know, as someone, as a Latina, my family were the Mexicans that the border crossed here in Colorado on my mother's side. On my biological father's side, we were Tarahumara Indians, natives. From my father who raised me, we were Black Wall Street. How do we bring people together to recognize that race and focusing on the symbolic wins and symbolic losses is not enough? How do we bring people to a place of solidarity to recognize that thing that's invisible underneath all of it, that is the reason we have race, slavery, and oppression? So I focus a lot on economics, capitalism. How did we get to this place where 1%, 2% of the population has more wealth than all of us combined? How did we get to a place where you have a narrative of the West that doesn't acknowledge racism, that doesn't acknowledge that the parallel to Black in the West was Indio, and that the Mexican-American War happened because of fighting over slave territory? So me, in my job, I am a person with a color consciousness in a colorblind space, in a system where we have created all of these laws to maintain the conditions that we have, to maintain and perpetuate the status quo of oppression. All of those pictures that you saw, most of those pictures you saw in Dr. Romero's presentation, from the articles about the color lines, the tagging on a house, the ink coffee sign, those all happened in my district. Those are all straight out of my district. The lawsuits that were filed here in Colorado to disrupt segregation came from people in my community. I am a proud Manual Thunderbolt. And when I talk to people about what Manual was, I talk about how Manual was the way that DPS got away with segregation. And do you know how they did it? Because Manual doesn't stand for Manuel. Manual was Manual Arts and Labor. Manual was created as the vocational school in DPS, the first vocational school, and it was connected to East High School. And it was the way to essentially do your first tracking of Black and brown kids who were still part of DPS. Maybe there was some poor white kids, but it was the way DPS got away with segregation. And so a lot of the very visible, tangible data to prove to us that racism exists happened in my neighborhood. My parents' alley is the color line it was the color line in the East Side. My neighborhood that I currently live in, of Swansea, is the most, next to Cancer Alley, It is one of the most egregious examples of environmental racism. It is 80216, the most polluted zip code in America. But it is no different than any other neighborhood across the country next to our rail lines, which were always our ways to generate profit, our highways, which evolved to be the next ways to generate commerce, profit, exchange in the country. We were the sacrifice neighborhoods because, like any other neighborhood across the country where you had to put something that was undesirable in order to generate things, products, resources that were desirable, you had to, one, find the workers to live there, which were probably Black, brown, or immigrant, and two, you had to keep them in hidden places so that the people who were benefiting from those products could not see the visible harm they were creating. Very little has changed. I just finished a fight over redistricting. We have learned how to evolve our system of oppression around money. We don't need laws to segregate anymore based on race. We don't need the old ways of doing this. All we need to do is have our people in appraisals who discriminate with appraisals on values of home and price people out. So gentrification, I know people don't like when we talk about it as neo-colonization. It is really the action of racism and slavery in this country. Gentrification creates second-class citizens. It creates a way to engineer homogeneous neighborhoods, and all in a way that is legal. In fact, we build laws around it that are very similar to our Jim Crow laws, our slave codes, our Black codes. Black codes, we had vagrancy laws. After slavery ended, we created Black codes and vagrancy laws to, on demand, go to a free man, a free Black man, and request proof of his employment. Otherwise, we could jail them. What is the difference between a vagrancy law and camping bans across cities in Colorado? There is no difference. So that's where I talk about from the teepees to tents. What is the difference? Very little. We can find someone in a tent, go up to them, find them for trespassing, find them for urination in public. We can find them for being on public right-of-way, and then put them in this system of criminalization that then allows them to be slaves in the Constitution. Black codes that disallowed gun ownership for Black people. Next week in committee, we have a ban being proposed by Denver's city attorney on concealed weapons, even if you have a license for a concealed carry, in any city facility, including parks, including rec centers. It's very broad. Do you know why that is? Because what happened in 2020? Black and brown people started arming themselves. And we did it following the law. We went and got the permits. We went and got our concealed carry cards because we have constitutional rights to protect ourselves. And the Times suggested that we needed to do so. And that showed them that there was too many of us getting armed. And so now, next week, 2022, we are about to pass an evolved version of a vagrancy code, of a Black code, right here in the Denver metro area. And we do it because of the symbolic wins, right? the symbolic gains against racism, we don't understand as a people how oppression works. We know the systems of oppression. We know all the isms, the racism, the sexism, the classism, all of that. But we don't understand the mechanisms that perpetuate these systems. I used to teach my students the 4 eyes of oppression. How many of you guys have heard of the 4 eyes of oppression? So institutional, ideological, interpersonal, and what was my other one? Institution, ideological, interpersonal. I can't think of it off the top of my head right now. And those are the ways that we pass it, that we pass our racism, our oppressive perceptions onto each other. And when we learn the mechanisms that perpetuate oppression, we can't just confront racism in front of our faces. We have to recognize that we as a people have internalized our oppression, whether that's racism, whether that's sexism, whatever it is. All of us belong to an institution, a church, a school, a family that has soaked in the messages about who we are because we're Black, who we are because we're women, who we are because we're whatever. And we soak those things in on a level that becomes part of our identity. But then, because of our symbolic wins for representation, we get plucked. Sometimes we win. Sometimes we get plucked up from our communities and we get to sit in seats like this. We get to be the thought leaders, the lawmakers, the mayors, the city council members. But we haven't dealt with that internalized oppression. We haven't dealt with how we ourselves can be brown-skinned, Black-skinned, and perpetuate white supremacy, perpetuate patriarchy. And so I sit in a seat with a historic amount of women on council, a historic amount of Latinas in a city that is, as of 2019, the top city displacing Latinos, the second top gentrifying city, and I have to fight my colleagues about forfeiting a majority-minority seat while we're redistricting. I lost that battle just last week. I lost the battle to preserve a majority-minority district on a map of a city that is erasing Latinos from the city. Already, we erased the Black community from Denver. And so this is it's so much bigger of a conversation for me than just how do we accept these symbolic wins around ending racism. To me, it's more about how do we get to a place of reparations and land back? How do we get to a place of recognizing that it is not enough for someone who looks like me, who has my matching skin or has my matching last name to be in a seat of power? How do we start to change the structure that made those things matter in the first place? So that's me.
Feel very strongly about the maps that came out of City Council, but in my district, Park Hill, we were very offended that our community was chopped up and cut up. And I'm sure you feel the same way about your community. But at this juncture, do we have to wait another 10 years before we go back and can do anything about it? Or can we fight it now?
So, one, I would like to point out how the lack of analysis around systemic oppression played into that fight. We are a people who are sensitive to being broken up, but we are not taught to sophisticate our understanding of what solidarity and staying together looks like. And so sometimes we take the way that we've been oppressed and we use it against ourselves. And so when we talk about breaking neighborhoods up, it's inconsequential to draw a line down Park Hill when half of Park Hill, when the line was separating the last part of Park Hill that's still Black.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it was inconsequential, but to have kept it together with other neighborhoods that are still Black and brown would have created Black-brown voting power.
Now, see, I disagree with you on that.
But I'm gonna answer the second part of your question.
Go ahead.
So the structure of why we get districts every 10 years, how many districts we have, all changeable. Our city has the parallel to a constitution. It's called our city charter. Our city charter can be changed whenever we want to change it, and it can be changed in two ways. City council members can refer a question or a change to the ballot, or the public can collect enough signatures to get something on the ballot, and then everybody votes on it to change it. We can say, we don't want this city charter anymore. We don't want our districts like this, or we don't want 11 districts. We want 50, and change that whenever we're ready to, or force the people who are supposed to represent you, your council members, to save you the money and the time and refer it to the ballot for us to vote on. Chile right now is changing their entire country's constitution because the people have risen up in Chile because they are tired of being a laboratory for neoliberalism for the United States. We could do it at the city level anytime we're ready.
Well, I think we need to do it now because being from Park Hill, the maps that were proposed are proposed to dilute the Black voting power. And I didn't see any maps except, I believe it was map E that was acceptable and would keep some of the communities intact. But what you just said, if we can actually do that and make a change, then I think city council should make the change. But if you're saying,
Map A did do that.
No, I don't agree with Map A.
Map A did do that. And what we have to confront is that there is no ability to maintain Black power. There is not enough Black people in the city of Denver.
I totally disagree. As a citizen,
in solidarity.
Well, I agree with that part, but North and Northeast Park Hill has enough Black voting power and enough Black residents to continue their tradition. So I think that's what city council missed. And so I know from your perspective, you think that because our Black communities have been destroyed, our Dahlia, our Holly, our Fairfax, and the other one I can't think of off the top of my head, even though those are gone because of gentrification, we still have a strong Black community in Green Valley Ranch, still a portion in Park Hill, and we can do that. We can absolutely continue on with our tradition of having a strong Black community. So, but thank you for answering that question so we can change it at any time. I like your suggestions.
Mm-hmm. All right, thank you to all of the panelists for this conversation. Obviously, this is something we could talk about. I just want to see if anybody, we are pretty much out of time, but if there's anybody in the audience that would like to ask a question, we could probably take one. Looks like we have one up here, so we'll get a microphone over there. Oh, okay.
So I'm actually from DC, and so I know what lobbying looks like, and I'm from a predominantly Black DC is predominantly Black, but now has sort of been gentrified over the past 15 years. And one of the things that struck me is even in DC's gentrification, schools were rebuilt and replaced, libraries, recreation centers. And so when I moved here and I was down in Denver with a friend, she lives off of Evans Drive, what struck me was I pay higher taxes here in Colorado than I did in DC. And yet the schools here are abysmal. The libraries are crumbling. There are basically no recreation centers. There are no programs for people. Marion Barry, whether you like him or not, was a very great advocate in DC in the sense that he helped young youth get summer jobs from the ages from like 13 up until 21. And I've never seen so many poor homeless people in DC in the summertime with no jobs. So I would like to know or in Denver, I'd like to know like what the local council members or district leaders are doing, because the basic foundation of wealth building and economics is education. And when I walk around in the year 2022 and I see crumbling buildings and libraries that are like not even what I would consider a library, what are people doing with that tax money?
Yeah, it's a good question. I lived in DC for 6 years and worked for DC public schools and have worked in Denver's public schools. We have a split system. So our public school system is run separately from our city council. So city council has no authority over our district. So they collect taxes separately. Colorado actually has really low property taxes, but the school district, I would say, let me put it this way. So very few public resources are compulsory. The government isn't going to take you to jail if you're not eating right, if you don't have a roof over your head, if you don't have utilities. None of those are public benefits that are compulsory. But why would public education be compulsory? And then you think back to the Native American boarding schools and how the public education institution was utilized for a very specific purpose during colonization. Very little has changed. In Denver specifically, we have one of the largest portfolios of privatized schools or charter schools. And when you think about the way that charter schools are often run, they're shaping students in a very particular way to be obedient, to be compliant. And there's a few community schools amongst the charter schools, but the large charter management organizations are building workers and prisoners.
I noticed that she lives near a charter school, and charter schools are very notorious. I used to be a teacher in DC, and also in Montgomery County, which is a very wealthy suburban neighborhood or county. And what really struck me is the number of public charter schools that are here, and they militarize their students. It's very obedient, compliant, so again, who's holding the charter schools accountable? Charter schools get a lot of funding from private donors, and yet the buildings are abysmal. I know I just moved here, but it's very striking to my friend, there's no recreation center. So she didn't know how to swim. She doesn't know how to swim. And that's so minute, and sure she could take swimming lessons and pay for those private lessons. But why aren't recreation centers something that's in almost every community that's free, that you pay taxes for? This is mind-blowing to me.
So here's my take. So I want to go back to your original question. My opinion of why Denver is more expensive than DC, and I totally agree with you, is because, in my opinion, because we were the first to legalize marijuana, then you have all these people converging onto our city, and it just went crazy. Our real estate is more expensive than it is in DC, but our taxes are more expensive. You know, property taxes, sales taxes, everything is more expensive here. They even had a piece on NPR the other day that Denver, Colorado, the rent here is $1,800. It's as expensive as San Diego, Seattle, Portland. But my belief is so many people have converged here because we were the first to legalize marijuana. And so it's all about the money. It's also gentrification. It's so many levels. And so that's why it appears as though it's more expensive to live here, which it is, and why it doesn't appear as though we have any free rec centers or any free programs, and the school system. That could be a whole nother topic right there. But
And I'll just very quickly add, and this goes back to, I think, some of the structural forces that are at play. I put up on the slide here, and we didn't talk about it, but I think part of this conversation today, we focused on, I mean, there was conversation on the federal constitution. I think we need to pay attention to things like state constitutions, things like local, city charters, right? Because they do embed or they do provide opportunities to address structural racism, right? So we have the Tabor Amendment, which was passed to the Colorado Constitution, which basically requires any tax increase needs to be subject to a public vote, right? Voters historically, those that come out for votes historically, right, don't typically vote to tax themselves. And there's a whole, it's tied to neoliberalism, there's a whole, architecture behind that. But after passage of what's called the Tabor Amendment here to our state constitution, Colorado went from one of the top 20 in terms of funding per pupil in the nation to the bottom 48, right? Like, so we're with Mississippi and, those, I think it was like 48, 49, if you look at those numbers, that is directed per pupil. So what does that mean? It means at the school level, at the district level, but it's usually at the individual district level, at the neighborhood level, how do you account for those differences, right? It's a lot of private fundraising that's happening. So that's another piece to I think, sort of take into account and really think about those sort of structural forces that are at play.
And Tabor is important because that is what's unique about Colorado with the revenue caps, but also the marijuana dollars that are generated that go to education, it only goes to new school construction. Right. And new school construction is only happening in the empty land that's available. And where is that? That is where people are being gentrified to, in the far northeast of Denver. And so these things are all connected. It creates the system of, okay, new school construction out in Green Valley Ranch. Okay, let's put worker housing out in Green Valley Ranch, move everybody from the inner city core to what is affordable housing in Green Valley Ranch. And so it all is connected in creating the segregation that we talked about, the economic segregation and the economic, and maintaining the power structure by maintaining who owns the land, who owns the assets, who owns all the amenities. It's all connected.
Or not only that, just piggybacking on Councilwoman CdeBaca, in my opinion, they have taken our land, our generational wealth from East Denver, Park Hill, pushed us out to Green Valley Ranch, and now these areas are now gentrified with the Starbucks, the Whole Foods, all of that. But still, the schools in the inner cities, even in Denver, Colorado, older schools don't have air conditioning. And you can attest to that a lot of schools, does Manual have air conditioning now?
I don't think so.
But yeah, it still goes back to that.
All right, well, thank you, everyone. That was the final panel of the day. So turn it over to Professor Malveaux for some closing remarks so we can head to our seats.
Thank you so much. Okay, so I have asked Professor Raylan Rabaka to give us some closing remarks, and then I'm going to go ahead and close this out completely. Let me go ahead and introduce Professor Rebaca, I'm excited to share that there is a new center on campus. I'm right that this is a relatively new center, the Center for African and African American Studies, what is known as CAUSE. And Dr. Rebaca is the director of that center, and they have co-sponsored this, the Rothgerber Conference with us this year. So we're really thrilled to be able to work in conjunction with that center. Dr. Rebaca is a professor of African American, and Caribbean Studies at the Department of Ethnic Studies and the founding director of CAUSE. And he is a research fellow in the College of Human Sciences at the University of South Africa. He has published 16 books and more than 75 scholarly articles. And so just a renowned person on this faculty, and we're really excited about this new partnership and new collaboration. So I'd love for Dr. Rebaca to come up and share some remarks, and then I'll close out the conference. Thank you.
Greetings, everybody. It is so wonderful to be here. I was able to catch some of the earlier panels online via Zoom because I was tied up in the cause. But I just want to say, I want to begin by saying thank you, Professor Malveaux. This partnership that we have between the White Center and the Center for African and African American Studies, I think it's going to be game-changing. We're sort of trying to transform CU into the space that we really want it to be. Let me let you in on the fact, I've been here 17 years, and this is probably the most comfortable I've been in a long time here at CU Boulder. I'm just keeping it real. I can't be any other way than who I am. And I want to start out by saying we don't get a lot of opportunities to talk about the enslavement. We don't get a lot of opportunities to talk about the genocide against indigenous people. We don't get a lot of opportunities to talk about crimmigration, the way that they treat brown people, you know, coming from the South. We don't get a lot of opportunities to talk about anti-Asian and anti-Asian American oppression in this country, and to be doing that in a very neoliberal space like the University of Colorado Boulder. Well, this is what decolonization looks like, sounds like, feels like. Welcome home, right? So to begin with those early panels on the enslavement, to talk about slavery, those nodal points, there's something powerful, there's something very solemn about being able to talk about the enslavement, but there's also something therapeutic to honor and acknowledge, to raise up and revere the names of the long unnamed, right? To think about human suffering, to think about tragedy, human tragedy, but also to think about triumph. Because if there wasn't triumph, we wouldn't be here right now, right? That's really important, right? The duality of it. Yeah, the bad, but also the good. Some strides are being made. We got a long way to go, but some strides are being made. So that first part of this, to think about, and this is something that Professor Malveaux and I talked about, to start big, and then to sort of bring it in a little bit more into focus, and then to go from the enslavement and to talk about Tulsa. That even after the enslavement, during the post-enslavement period, racial violence continues. During the post-enslavement period, racial terrorism continues. You see, the Ku Klux Klan was created after the enslavement. People just changed the words. They put some words on pretty papers. I feel like Martin Luther King and I Have a Dream. They put some words on some pretty pieces of paper, but unless we make them uphold it, nothing's gonna really change. That's what this is really about, transformation. And so Tulsa, for us to memorialize it, to think about it, to challenge K through 12 to teach it, Professor Malveaux to challenge CU Boulder to teach it, to make it a permanent part of our curriculum, the importance of this. And then to bring it home to Colorado, land ownership and the laws here in Colorado, and how that speaks to us in a very special way, because I think sometimes people have a tendency to sort of write stuff off. Well, it's happening in Ukraine. It's happening in, you know, there, here, there. We got a lot of wicked, tricky stuff that's happening right here in Boulder, this beautiful suburb of the state capital, Denver, Colorado. And we know that in the suburbs, sometimes there is often as much horror and hell taking place as there is in the more urban environments. And for us to be able to connect all of these dots and to be able to do that here at CU that, again, has marginalized us, has rendered a lot of us invisible, has erased us, for us to have a space to do that, to meditate on that, to marinate on that is so incredibly important. I want to thank all of the panelists for sharing with us, for teaching me, because this is why I'm out here. I want to practice lifelong learning. I want to thank all of the panelists. I certainly want to thank all of the folks in the White Center, especially the fearless leader and my colleague, Professor Suzette Malveaux. Thank you so much for this opportunity. And thank you also for this partnership. This is what, this is only the beginning. We've said that. This is only the beginning of our partnership. And I'd like to invite everybody here to the grand opening this fall. We are not open yet, which is why I couldn't even be here today. I'm trying to build us a home. I'd like to invite you all to the grand opening this fall. I don't even have a date yet because I don't have staff to even tell you a date and organize this yet. Forgive me, I'm telling off on them. But I want to invite you all to the grand opening. But again, thank you for this opportunity to partner with you in the White Center. Thank y'all.
Your support. We really appreciate it. I know you didn't have a lot, and you brought whatever you could to the table. So I'm looking forward to our collaboration in the future. All right, I'd like to close out, and maybe I just want to thank you so much for just an amazing day. I mean, just the conversations. You guys really brought it, and so I am so touched and grateful that people traveled all over the country to be here and to do this and to make this such a special experience. So thank you for being brilliant. Thank you for being brave. We had fireworks going on. We had real serious conversation and conflict. And that takes a lot of courage, right? To put that out there and to admit we don't all see it the same way. And we need to have those conversations. And so thank you for being so thoughtful, right? I feel very enriched by that. I was struck by something that Colette said yesterday, and for many of you who were able to be at Modus Theater and hear some of the monologists, this is Colette is one of the monologists who is formerly incarcerated. And what she said was, I was incarcerated before I went to prison. Like, that really struck me. Like, oh yeah, that's right. This is really, for me, what this was about, unlocking our minds, really sort of taking the shackles off of our thinking, really trying to understand one another, really trying to grapple with these very serious problems, very complicated and complex issues. So I'm going to hold that, and I really want to thank you for that. So now to some more kind of like mundane things. I'm going to switch gears. We are going to be asking people for feedback, and so there will be a survey that will come out on Monday. If you give us your feedback, please. If you like what you saw, let us know. If there are ways that we can grow, by all means, do let us know. We're trying to do this programming the best we can. We have limited resources too, so we're a little stretched, but. So please do that. For the lawyers that are out there, alums and lawyers, this is, I think, 8 CLE credits approved. That's a lot of CLE credits, right? So fill out the forms. The forms are gonna come, get those CLE credits. For the students, you get Care Pledge credits. I don't know if that's, by all means, go and get the credits that are related to that. That is a new program that we're doing, anti-racism effort, and you get credits for participating and for being a part of this. And so by all means, do that as well. I wanted to just thank the people who made this happen. Oops. Oh my goodness, what's happening here? I don't, we're just teeing up the credits. I don't know, those aren't my credits. Wow, okay. Those are not the thank yous. I had mine, but okay. So the thank yous, although I will thank Teresa, our IT folk. Let's start there, right? Teresa, and I'm sorry, bring out your colleague. I don't know the gentleman's name. Sorry, I didn't get the name. Okay, oh, please, okay, thank you, guys. Thank you. You can't do any of this without IT. You guys are the most important people, right, in these events. Especially for those who are participating by Zoom. And so we so appreciate your effort and your work. I'll start with the most important person, right, in terms of the event, which is Yesenia Delgado, our events manager. None of this is possible without Yesenia. So what a beautiful job. It really all came together. And like I said, we have limited resources. We're operating on kind of some shoestring budgets and staffing and things like that. So we're down quite a few folks. And so Yesenia has really stepped into the breach. I so appreciate that. Other folks who are on our planning team, I need to thank Kelly Ilsang. I need to thank Lindy Bell, Assistant Dean Fernando Guzman. Where is he? He was here. Where is he? Oh, he was here. Okay, he was here. Jamie Henderson. So also want to really, really thank our White Center fellows who put this together. They have done an amazing job. All right, so Aaron Vanek, where's Aaron Vanek? We have April Fortner. We have Sam McCarthy, where's Sam? Kende Winful and Ben Hepler. So round of applause for the students who've done a beautiful job, just a beautiful job. Our law review students. All right, so we have the law review students who have been extremely helpful, and we're so encouraging people to publish your work with them, right? This is an excellent journal. We want to amplify your voices. And so by all means, it doesn't have to be long article. We're going to have monologues from the night before, but even if it's just your remarks or a poem or some contribution that you've brought, put it together in an essay. Doesn't have to be long, but please contribute to the journal. So the law review students, we have Melpo Vasilou, we have Mary Beth Beasley, Alyssa Ortiz, Rachel Martinez, Louisa Clark, and Marina Fleming. Can we get a round of applause? All right. I'm hoping I didn't forget anybody on the journal. Thank you for your support. We also had outreach. So we worked with Robin Munn, who I don't see here. She was very helpful in getting the word out, and Nicole Much. She helped us as well. Unfortunately, the dean has left, but I want to give a big congratulations, of course, to our new dean, Lolita Buckner-Ennis, for really supporting our work and for giving us the inspiration, right? Starting that conversation off, I think, in such a powerful way. And then, of course, finally, the Modus Theater folks last night, right? Which I think really grounded us, and I think, kind of set our priorities straight in terms of why we do this work. So all the monologuists and poets and musicians and organizers there, I just want to give them applause, and they may not be here, but. So thank you very much. I think in terms of where we go from here, I'm hoping most of you will continue to be brave and go on a little hike. We'll call it a walk. It's probably really just a walk, but we're gonna gather. So if you need to put on some comfortable shoes, if you brought a change of clothes, I'm gonna get out of this old, dress and put on some walking shoes and just be a little bit more comfy. Then we're gonna meet together and we'll take over. I have a car, a couple of people, we have cars we can take you over with. If not, we're gonna do a Lyft or Uber, and we'll go over to Chautauqua Park. We have students that are gonna help us with that. So, sort of help organize. We will go there and then hopefully just get a chance to finish some of these conversations, because I can see there's a lot more we need to cover. We had to cut some people off quick. So we can continue those conversations on our hike informally, and then we're gonna go to the Chautauqua Dining Hall right afterwards and have dinner. So if people are in town and want a fellowship, then we are really happy to continue those conversations, okay? So I think we're gonna leave it there. Yesenia, where do people meet and at what time for the hike? I just wanna be clear. But, okay.
15 to 20 minutes.
Okay, so about 15 minutes, so maybe 5:15, 5:20, if people want to just get more comfy and we can meet there. If it turns out you're not able to make the walk or the hike, don't let that deter you from joining us for dinner later, which we'll probably make it to the Chautauqua Dining Hall around what time you think? Around 6:30-ish, yeah. 6:30-ish or so, we'll be at the dining hall, yeah. Yeah, okay. Okay, so any questions? Are we good? We're good? We're good? Okay, well, let's consider this adjourned. Thank you again for your time.